Okay, I think we can begin. So welcome everybody to this week's edition of the class series on metaphor, the importance of metaphor as LaRouche understood it. And tonight we have the second part of Susan Kokinda's presentation. If you have not seen either her last week's first presentation or any of the other classes in this series that began with Dan Leach's class on poetry, my class was followed by my class on on science and metaphor, and then a class by Miwa Steger. They're all posted on the LaRouche PAC website, and I urge you to go back and take a look at them. If you miss them, don't be worried, because what Susan has to say tonight will get you geared to go back and look at those as well. So I don't want to give much of an introduction because I know that Susan has a lot to say. So why don't we just turn it right over to her to get started with tonight's presentation.
All right. Thanks, Bruce. So last week we began to explore why the apologists of empire and globalism are so furious at Plato. Not just Plato, they're furious at the very concept of the republic. They hate the conception of national sovereignty, which is embedded in the republic. And what this always boils down to is their rejection, denial, or hatred of the concept that there are universal principles and that the human mind can discover and know and act on universal principles. So I referenced in particular last week a so-called philosopher named Karl Popper, who is an Austrian who had to flee Austria during the Hitler period and ultimately ended up in London at the London School of Economics, where he became a colleague and associate of Friedrich Von Hayek of the Austrian Economics School, and where he became the mentor and teacher of George Soros. And Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, was the reason that George Soros named his organization the Open Society. Just to remind people of how much Popper hates Plato, I want to read a couple of different quotes than I did last week from the Open Society. Popper claims that Plato believes that true happiness is achieved only by justice, and that only happens by one's keeping one's place. The ruler must find happiness in ruling, the warrior in warring, and we may infer, says Popper, the slave in slaving. Apart from that, Plato says frequently that he is aiming at neither the happiness of individuals nor of any of those particular classes, but only of the happiness of the whole. And this, he argues, is nothing but the outcome of that rule of justice, which I, namely Karl Popper, have shown to be totalitarian in nature. He then goes on to say that Plato was forced by his philosophy to combat free thought and the pursuit of truth. He was led to defend lying, political miracles, tabooistic superstition, the suppression of truth, and ultimately brutal violence. And much of this derives from Popper's claim that Plato believes that only by returning to tribalism and a fixed, unchanging society will mankind be able to find happiness. Now, as we discussed last week, this tirade of against Plato by Popper comes from somebody who hates metaphor, or perhaps doesn't even have a clue that metaphor exists, but I suspect it's the former, and fears the power of the human mind to know the universe. These Popper and his ilk, these people I think we could call the anti-metaphorians. There's someone who, like Thrasymachus, who we met in the Republic last week, just gets completely angry at Socrates because Socrates is exploring how to discover what the idea of justice is. And Thrasymachus just breaks into the dialogue and demands of Socrates, I want you to tell me in straightforward terms, what is justice? You know, in essence, he's saying, define this noun for me. I'm not interested in anything else. Popper, well, actually, Thrasymachus gets organized by Socrates over the course of the dialogue. He's a far superior character than Popper or Von Hayek or George Soros. These are people who would argue that each note or each phrase in a great symphony is what the composer believes. Because what they're really rejecting is the creative power of the human mind to discover principles in the universe and to constantly improve our understanding of those principles, and therefore with some foresight to be able to act knowably on the future. And I think these two different worldviews, the one of the anti-metaphorians and the one of the Promethean conception of being able to discover principles in the universe and act with forethought, which is what the word Prometheus actually means. I think maybe this is most accessible and clearest for people in the domain of economics, which we also touched upon briefly last week. But if you look at the British philosophical liberals, they argue, as Adam Smith explicitly does, that man cannot know the consequences of his actions, that he could only act from the standpoint of individual greed, or as Smith puts it, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, or the pursuit of profit and the avoidance of loss. In this world, in the world of these people, everybody acts heteronomically. When you're dealing with the philosophical conflict between the one and the many, in the world of Adam Smith, in the world of the British philosophical liberals, it's the many unleashed in terms of their individual passions, their individual pursuit of pleasure. There is no one, but even in their train of philosophy, they recognize that that really doesn't work, that somehow something has to bring some kind of order to this. And frankly, what they do is they just resort to magic. Bernard Mandeville, whose infamous fable of the bees was like the precursor for Adam Smith and many others, he says that private vices will lead to public virtue. How? He just asserts it. Adam Smith makes it a little bit more explicit. He brings in magic. He says the magic of the marketplace is some kind of ordering principle which is going to make it all work out. Smith's follower, or at least in the same train of thinking, Popper's colleague, Friedrich Von Hayek, also at the London School of Economics with Popper, Friedrich von Hayek puts it quite bluntly. He says, it was man's submission to the impersonal forces of the market that in the past has made possible the growth of civilization. How? He doesn't really say how. He just asserts it because he wants to, frankly. But even then they run into trouble with their so-called philosophy. They say that it's all fine and good to let individual passions, pursuit of pleasure, operate from the standpoint of individuals. But you run into a problem in their world when you get to nations, because von Hayek argues that if nations operate on the same basis as individuals, we run into a problem. He says, economic transactions between national bodies who are at the same time the supreme judges of their own behavior and whose representatives cannot be bound by any considerations but the immediate interest of their respective nations must end in clashes of power. So if nations act in their own interest, you're going to end up in perpetual conflict with other nations. And Von Hayek continues, we cannot hope for order or lasting peace after this war if states, large or small, regain unfettered sovereignty in the economic sphere. So what's their solution? Because I think I would suggest that their idea of the open society, democracy, free market, and so on is ultimately, frankly, from their standpoint, one big fat lie, because they know it really doesn't work. Either they suggest we have the magic of the marketplace, we have magic, or Von Hayek says, as far as the conflict among individual nations, if they're each pursuing their own interests, he says, what's the solution? Is an international authority which effectively limits the power of the state over the individual. This will be one of the best safeguards of peace. And he continues, the form of international government under which certain strictly defined powers are transferred to an international authority, while only other aspects are left in the hands of individual countries. This, of course, is that of federation. So they really don't believe in an open society. They believe in the unleashing, perhaps, of the power of the many as a way of, as simply a cover story for what their ultimate intention is. Because behind the fraud of the open society of Popper and George Soros is what we see today. We see the drive toward world government. We see a dictatorship of private bankers who have consolidated their power through the system of central banking. And what is it that they've ruled out? They've ruled out the fact that man's mind can know universal principles, and that such principles are the basis for actually governing a republic. When you think of it in these terms, the conflict between the one and the many is a phony conflict, or it's a conflict in a static world of logical categories. But the individual human mind can know, can discover less and less imperfectly universal principles. And again, that is the basis for a republic. Now, from the standpoint of Popper and from the standpoint of Soros, any assertion that such principles are knowable to man's mind and are communicable to others and are susceptible of being acted on in the form of economics or in the form of your government, these are hysterically rejected. They reject the idea of a republic or a sovereign nation state as a vehicle through which this kind of process can unfold. Instead, they want the magic of the marketplace, but ultimately, as is clear, they want it regulated by a world government or by central banks. So, I mean, when you, and again, I'm developing this again because the philosophical discussion over this apparent conflict between the one and the many is really very central to understanding the evil and the criminality of people like George Soros, Karl Popper, and their ilk. Because on the one hand, well, they purport to give free rein to the many through their open society and the free market. What is really lurking behind that is their understanding that the world would not be governable in those forms. And so they flip to the one. a banker's dictatorship or world government. If you look at George Soros's Open Society, it's clearly not for the Canadian truckers. It's not for the people who are fighting against vote fraud. And it's certainly not an open society for Donald Trump. Their beliefs, their ideas, their fight for principle are not allowed in that open society. So I want to look at this, continue to look at this question again and re-look at it through Plato's line, through Plato's eyes, and go to an image which I used in the last class to further elaborate this. This is the image which is often referred to as the divided line, but I find it easier to put it in more of a chart so it doesn't look like a line. But I want to revisit this, even though we did look at it last week. This is something which is developed in the book 6 of Plato's Republic. And as we discussed last week, I mean, the first 5.5 books or so of Plato's Republic are this very intense discussion of how do you construct a republic, how do you choose the guardians of a republic, how do you train them, what are the attributes of the guardians, and so on. And what Plato has embedded in the dialogue is a whole lot of assumptions, which they then build the structure of the training of the guardians and the republic and so on. Now, the idiocy of people like Popper, whose Open Society is just an attempted thoroughgoing attack on Plato's Republic, is, again, I call them the anti-metaphorians, because they have, either he doesn't get, but he probably does get, and he's just lying, what Plato is actually doing, which is taking you through a series of hypotheses. And you drive through the implications of one of these hypotheses. Sometimes it gets very jarring, as we discussed last week. But at a certain point in the Republic, Plato stops short, or through the person of Socrates, stops short and says, wait a minute, we really did not look thoroughly at what our underlying assumptions are. And we really can't talk about any of these things unless we seek to discover how we can organize our society in keeping with the highest principle, which is the concept of the good. And Socrates very humbly says, I don't think I really can know the good or answer that question of what is the good, but I think we can work on the offspring of the good. This is the point at which the entire composition shifts, and the rest of the composition of the Republic becomes this beautiful exploration of how the human mind thinks, how the human mind apprehends things. And toward the end of book 6, he develops this idea, this metaphor of the divided line. And as I say, I find it easier to use it in the form of this image that I have before you. And what Plato and Socrates have done is they have divided the domains of how the human mind knows into 2 areas. The first you see there, through the eyes, things which are seen through the eyes. The Greek word is oratos. And this is basically the domain of the senses. And on the right side, you have through the mind. The Greek word for mind is nous. So these are things which are apprehensible through the mind. So these are the 2 main divisions, but then within each one, you have a further division. The top 2 boxes are what he calls the images, or on the one side, and mental images and axioms on the other. In the side, on the domain of the eyes, it's pretty easy to comprehend. You can have the shadow of an object or an image in a mirror or a pond or whatever. And then on the bottom, you have the actual objects. which generate those images. You see I've got the concepts in bold and then below them in italics. The italics are in a sense the faculties which Plato asserts look at the objects that are in bold. But again, when you get over to the side of the mind, as we discussed last week, the top box is a little more challenging, but the best, I think, approach to it is what your mind does when it perhaps is working through a geometrical problem. Socrates says, you're starting with certain assumptions and axioms. You have certain mental images, maybe of a square and a diagonal, but you're working through problems in your mind. But this is not the highest level of thinking. And that is the level which is on the bottom there, universals, essences, ideas. This is where your mind is grappling to discover the actual underlying principles and the actual underlying causes of thinking. It's the place where Plato talks about pure ideas moving on through ideas and ending with ideas. I wanted to review this because, as in last week's question and answer period, it kind of struck me that when you're looking at, if you look at the dialogue in our culture today, if you look at political discourse today, or what most people think are the principles of economics, or even what they try and shove down our throats today from the standpoint of follow the science. This is all on the side of the senses and the eyes. This is on the side of picture thinking or beliefs. Actually, the bottom left-hand box, the actual sensual objects, I probably should have also put in there opinion, beliefs, and opinion. This is the world of Karl Popper and George Soros. It's only in this domain on this side. It's only in the domain, not of principles, not of causes, not of anything going on in your mind, but it's in the domain of opinions and it's in the domain of beliefs. And in their world, every opinion has equal weight. You know, this is their democracy of 57 varieties of sexual orientation. Every opinion, every belief has equal weight. But if you're going to function in a republic, if you're going to be a citizen of a republic, you actually have to live on the other side. You have to live on the noetic side of this image. That's the side of the mind. That's the side which can generate higher hypotheses, that can discover the method by which you can generate higher hypotheses, what is referred to as the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. Plato's dialogues are explorations of the process by which the mind does this, by which the mind can discover constantly things which are brand new to the human mind, and that the mind itself creates these discoveries. Now, that doesn't mean you don't use the objects of sense to do it. It doesn't mean that there are no such things as assumptions and axioms and so on. But as Socrates and Plato put it in this discussion, these are the springboards that you work through in your mind that will take you to the principles and the powers that allow you to act in the universe and that lie in the non-sensible noetic domain. And you can only govern a republic in the domain, in this domain of the noetic. Now, Plato's world is the world in which this is happening. This is not a value-free world. This is not an anything goes world. This is a world in which, and a world in the universe in which the cause of knowledge and truth and justice and the beautiful is the good. I want to refer once again to a quote that I did use last week. But again, this is also from Book 6 of the Republic, but it is Plato's assertion that the good is the highest ordering principle. I won't read the whole quote. I'm going to read the first sentence and the last sentence. He says, "You must conceive the idea of the good as being the cause of knowledge and of truth, so far as is known. While it is right to consider knowledge and truth as being like the good or bona form, neither of them is the good, because that still higher honor belongs to the possession of the good." As I mentioned earlier, there's no contradiction in Plato's world between the processes of human knowledge and the way the universe itself is organized. And this concept of, and we're going to meet this again a little bit later, but this concept of the good is something which envelops Plato's conception of human knowledge, and it's something which envelops his understanding of the universe. I'm going to turn now briefly to his great masterwork, the Timaeus, and remind people, as I mentioned last week, that Plato wrote the Republic as part of a trilogy. Socrates had the discussion about the Republic one day with a group of people, and then the next day he had a discussion with a somewhat different group of people called the Timaeus, which is really on the question of the creation of what is the nature of the universe within which you are going to try and organize your republic. So on the first day, he's talking about the principle of the good in terms of how human beings know anything. And on the second day, he's talking about the principle of the good as that which God uses to create the universe. And I might mention here that in this particular section, in this area, in this section of the Timaeus, where Plato is talking about the most profound conceptions in terms of the universe, he's using God in the singular. He is not talking about some kind of polytheistic universe. He is talking about a monotheistic universe. So I'll read this quote as well. "Let us now state the cause for which he composed becoming or creation and the all. He was good." He's speaking of God. "He was good, and in him that is good, no envy ever arises. And being devoid of envy, he desired that all should be created, so far as possible like himself. Whoever accepts this foremost principle of creation and the cosmos, when it is offered by thoughtful men, is accepting it wisely. For God desired that so far as possible, all things should be good and nothing evil. Wherefore, when he took over all that was visible, it was in a state of disorder and dissonance. He brought it into order out of disorder, deeming that order is always better than disorder. For him who is most good, it was not permissible to commit any action other than the most beautiful." Now, let's go back to Popper's world and the world of British empiricism and existentialists and so on. Theirs is a world, a static world of sensible things. And even if you have a concept, say, of justice, which Popper throws around quite a bit, in their world of opinions and beliefs, their world, which admits really of no actual principles, how can you prove that your definition of justice is any more than an opinion or a belief? You can't. We have to live in Plato's world. This is the world of Kepler. This is the world of Leibniz. This is the world of Einstein. This is the world of Lyndon LaRouche. They all treated the question of how you know what you know against a universe which is both knowable and which is good. So let's look a little more deeply at how Plato animates your mind to make discoveries in such a world. I'm going to turn now to, I can get my cursor to work here. A section from Plato's Seventh Letter, which I read in the last class series, which is a really, really delightful discussion of how the human mind creates a new concept, a living concept. And people may remember he uses as an example how you come up with an actual concept of a circle. And he goes through the fact that the circle is not its name only. It is not only its definition. It is not only an image of it that you may draw on this in the sand or otherwise. So he says, after much effort, as names, definitions, sites, and other data of sense are brought into contact and friction one with another in the course of scrutiny and kindly testing by men who proceed by question and answer without ill will, with a sudden flash, there shines forth understanding about every problem and an intelligence whose efforts reach the furthest limits of human powers. And this question of, I mean, we all know that sudden flash. We all know that aha moment when suddenly our mind makes a discontinuous leap. It goes someplace it had not been before. It realizes that the way you were looking at it was wrong. And it comes up with a higher conception, a better way of understanding it. That is what Plato is constantly driving at in his dialogues, to create a series of those kinds of breakthroughs over the course of any particular dialogue. And when you think about the question of a circle, a circle is something which is actually generated by physical motion. As Bruce described in his class a couple of weeks ago, you can put a stake in the ground, you can put a rope on it, you can, pull the rope taut and you walk around with a taut rope and you're making a circle. Or you can stand in one place and put your arms out and turn. And, your fingertips are going to trace out a circle. It's an actual physical action in the universe. And out of that circular action and higher orders of spiral action, but we'll stick with circular action for the moment, you can then generate other geometrical things, like you can create a line by folding a circle over in half against itself. You've created the line. It's not some crazy definition of something between 2 points. Any human mind, when they're told that that's the definition of a mind, is then going to say, well, what the hell is a point? It's some non-existent thing in space. But rather, the generation of the concept of a circle as something which is taking place in physical space-time is really at the essence of the truly human process of acting on the universe. And if you can look at it in different kinds of, look at a different example of something which is generated by its existence in the physical universe. Look at the question of a hanging chain, the shape which is created if you take a necklace like this one, but hold it, so that it just hangs. It creates a particular shape in space. which is not particularly a mathematical shape. And it's a shape which the great scientist and builder Brunelleschi realized gave him the insight into solving the scientific and technological problems, and allowed him to construct the beautiful dome in Florence. I'm going to show you a picture of it. This is a picture of it from the book we published of Lyndon LaRouche's writings entitled The Science of Christian Economy. But when Brunelleschi had to solve the problem of how did you construct a huge freestanding, there's no flying buttresses in here, a huge freestanding dome over the base, which was the largest base ever constructed. Now, I bring that up because in January of 2020, just a little over 2 years ago, right before the world was turned upside down with COVID and the pandemic, Donald Trump went to the belly of the beast. He went to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and he challenged the oligarchs. He challenged their philosophical outlook. He challenged the fact that they were pessimistic, that they felt that there were not solutions to the crises. I mean, he didn't put it in so many terms, but essentially he was saying that, they're saying mankind either has to stop or to go backwards. And what he did in that speech is he said, you have an example of what man can do just a couple of 100 miles from here, because they were in Davos, Switzerland. And he spoke of Brunelleschi's dome. He spoke of the great breakthrough, the fact that the base of the dome had stood the dome had stood unconstructed for over 100 years until Brunelleschi came along. And what is it that Brunelleschi did? He discovered a physical principle in the universe, which allowed him to solve, again, the scientific and technological problems that existed. And when you look at great minds like Brunelleschi or Leibniz, you know that this process, this sudden flash of these various elements of a problem rubbing against each other, as Plato describes it, as it says, brought into contact and friction with one another. And with a sudden flash, there shines forth the understanding about this. I mean, this is the process that goes on, in the minds of great scientists, but it's also the process that goes on in the minds of great men who build things. They may not be scientific discoverers per se, but if you look at people, I've been struck by the comparison of descriptions of what went on in the mind of Henry Ford, what went on in the mind of Henry Ford and what seems to go on in the mind of Elon Musk. I read a description by one of the people who came up with Ford throughout his 40 years. And he said that what Ford would do when he was grappling with a technical problem is, they could tell that he had entirely complex technical problems in his mind that he was playing with, that he was working on, and that he would make some kind of breakthrough in terms of solving a problem, and he would try and explain it to people. But of course, it was a new idea. And the biggest challenge was for his production guys and guys who were doing the blueprints to get out of Ford's mind what that breakthrough was, so that they could put it in a blueprint and they could actually build it. And with Musk, it seems to be similar. I read an account in his biography, I think it was his former wife, describing how sometimes she would get up in the middle of the night and he would be standing in the middle of a hallway, just not moving, like in a trance, because he was doing that same thing. This process that Plato describes here in the 7th letter, so that when you get that flash, that aha, when you solve something, then you have to figure out how to communicate it, how to build it, and so on and so forth. But this is what provokes your mind to move in a lawful way. Now, I want to show you I want to go through two more examples of this mental process, this metaphorical process, since this is the subject of this class, in two others of Plato's dialogues. One is from the Philebus, and the other is from his fairly daunting dialogue called the Parmenides. Now, I'm just taking sections, and what I believe are very, very powerful and beautiful sections, but in no way am going to pretending that I'm doing any justice to the actual composition and thorough exposition of these dialogues. But let's start with the Philebus, and appropriately, given the fact that we've been talking about the importance of the good, the subject of the Philebus dialogue is the question of what is a good life. Socrates is in dialogue with two people, Philebus, for whom it's named, who believes that the good life is a life of pleasure. It's a life of enjoyment. He's in the Adam Smith school. All you have to do is pursue pleasure, and that's your good life. Philebus actually does not engage too much in the dialogue. A person named Protarchus actually picks up most of the discussion with Socrates. Socrates, to the contrary, says the good life is a life which is dominated by wisdom and mind. Now, is often the case with Plato's dialogues, as with any great composition, he gives you some clues at the very outset. And at the beginning of the Philebus, he hits you with two clues. The first is when Plato is making an assertion, and he asserts, which Protarchus agrees with, but he asserts that the only way you can determine the condition and disposition of a good life or a happy life is through your soul. Well, we're going to have a little bit of trouble dealing with pleasure and the senses if the soul is actually going to be the arbiter of determining whether it's a good life. So he's already thrown this in. And this develops throughout a very long and beautifully unfolding dialogue. The other clue that he throws in is right at the outset. He says, Socrates says to Protarchus, well, we have to, before we start, realize that we might end up discovering that it's neither pleasure nor wisdom which defines a good life. There might be something else which is higher than both of them. Now, this is pure Plato, where constantly he's taking what are apparent conflicts and contradictions and logical conundrums that where you seem to be in, stuck. And he does something which causes your mind to move to a different place, just like great poetry, just like what Dan discussed in his class and what Miwa discussed in her class. This often takes the form of how do you deal with the relationship and the contradiction between two opposite concepts, like the one in the menu, which we've been talking about, or the finite and the infinite. So at a certain point, Socrates puts forward the following question. He says, he's talked about the fact that there are many kinds, there's pleasure, but then there are many kinds of pleasure. There's colors, but then there is the concept of color, but then there's many kinds of color. Some of, you have black, you have white, they're opposites, playing with how do all of these things relate to each other. So at a certain point, Socrates says, since infinite numbers of things can come into existence because of this unity, like color as a single idea, but infinite numbers of things can come into existence. Does that mean that the unity is partaking of the many or dispersed among many and therefore is both one and many? And he asks the same question from the standpoint of the finite and the infinite. Now, he comes to a resolution of this in a very, very striking section. But before I actually turn to it, I want to briefly remind people of Bruce's discussion of Cantor and his concept of cardinal numbers and his higher concept of the transfinite. That is, when you're looking at the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're infinite. You can always add a 1 and keep going infinitely. Bruce talked about some of the paradoxes of the fact that even numbers, even though it seems like there's less even numbers than there are counting numbers, nonetheless are also infinite. And how Cantor defined this idea of a cardinality of number. That is, the counting numbers are in a sense a class, a cardinality, which are defined by the process by which they are created. That is, you have the infinite series of numbers. You have the concept of counting numbers, and then you have the process by which they're created, which is you add 1. And you can do the same thing in terms of the even numbers and other categories of numbers. So I just wanted to refresh people's minds on that before I read this section from Plato, because when I read this section of the Philebus for the first time, I said, oh my gosh, this is Cantor. So they've gone through some, as usual, easy ways of looking at things, which Socrates rejects. And Protarchus at one point then says, so what is this road? Uniquely, tell us. And Socrates says, and bear with me, this is not that easy, but keep the image of the counting numbers in your mind, and I think you'll get through this. Socrates says, one which is easy to point out, but very difficult to follow. For through it, all the inventions of art have been brought to light. Remember that. All of the inventions of art have been brought to light. This is the road. A gift of God's to men, as I believe, was tossed down from some divine source through the agency of some Prometheus, together with a gleaming fire. And the ancients, who were better than we and lived nearer the gods, handed down the tradition that all things which are ever said to exist are sprung from one and many, and have inherent in them the finite and the infinite. We must not apply the idea of infinite to plurality, the many, until we have a view of its whole number between infinity and 1. Then and not before, we may let each unit of everything pass on unhindered into infinity. And then and not before, we may let each unit of everything pass on. The gods then handed down to us this mode of investigating, learning, and teaching. But the wise men, I probably should have retranslated that, the sophists of the present day, because wise is the same root as sophos is the same word that the sophists, the rhetoricians of the day, and I think this is what he's referring to. But the sophists of the present day make the one and the many too quickly or too slowly in haphazard fashion. And they put infinity immediately after unity. They disregard all that lies between them. And this is what distinguishes between the dialectic, which is Plato's method, and the disputatious method, which is the method of the sophists. Now, again, go back to that concept of, you've got the infinite series of counting numbers. You've got the single concept of a counting number, but then you have the process which actually defines a counting number. This is how Plato, and this is what Plato is talking about, where you can't disregard that all that lies between the infinite and the finite. And that this, again, to go back to the beginning, it is through this that all inventions of art have been brought to light. And the fact that it is some Prometheus which has handed this down is this question of man being able to act on the universe. That Prometheus gave to mankind not only the gift of fire, but knowledge of sciences and arts and mathematics and construction, such that we could use our mind to actually transform the universe. But you only do this if you're using the creative powers of the human mind to discover the actual physical processes in the universe, not some dead, sterile world of logical categories, or not some dead, sterile world of numbers. Let me stop that. So this is only the first of a series of hypotheses which Plato puts forward in the Philebus. But this reference to Prometheus, of which there are not that many in Plato's dialogues, this is, to me, one of the clearest, one of the most powerful images in all of his dialogues. And it's this very beautiful exploration of how do you actually know a concept? How do you know a universal principle, some kind of universal principle? So I want to very briefly bring you through one final image in Plato's perhaps most daunting dialogue, which is the Parmenides dialogue. I think I want to just say that the Parmenides dialogue is this exhaustive exploration of all the conflicts that come from dealing with these two, in a sense, inert conceptions of the one and the many, or the same and other, other, younger and older, and all of these attributes that are that you deal with in these kinds of discussions. Now, and Parmenides, as people may or may not know, is a philosopher who essentially put forward the idea that the only thing there is the one. And he had an associate named Zeno who agreed with him, but his argument was simply to prove that any assertion that there was the many was just absurd. So he kind of proved Parmenides' hypothesis about the one in the negative. And these are the people who are in dialogue with Socrates. This is the earliest dialogue set by Plato. It's set in 450, way before the Persian War, rather the Peloponnesian War, way before anything else. And to my thinking, it's Plato's assertion of the beginning of the philosophical problems which ultimately lead to the destruction of Athens. But in this dialogue, and there's a hint at the beginning, which because of questions of time, I don't think I'm going to really address, but there's a hint at the beginning in terms of why Parmenides, the problems with the way Parmenides is looking at things, which sort of shapes, as in many cases with Plato, shapes the rest of the dialogue. But there's one point in this whole thing, and everybody who's read the Parmenides dialogue 1, 2, 3, 4 times, it can be it's exhaustive, and it can be exhausting. Although at one point, maybe after I'd read it 3 or 4 times, I said to myself, maybe I shouldn't be taking this quite so seriously. Maybe I better consider the fact that this is one big, poking at the impotence and sterility of these guys. And that's still a very credible hypothesis. But there's one point in the dialogue which I want to highlight, because it's of a piece of what I've been discussing earlier in these other dialogues. It comes at a point where they're dealing with the paradox of rest and motion. It's the top quote from the Parmenides. So this is Socrates asserting the following. And this is really an extraordinary section if you're paying attention, if you haven't been completely worn out by the exhaustive investigation of these other things, and it's worth it. Socrates says, it is impossible for something to be previously at rest and afterwards in motion, or previously in motion and afterwards at rest without changing. And there is no time in which anything can be at once neither in motion nor at rest. And it certainly cannot change without changing. Then when does it change? For it does not change when it is at rest, or when it is in motion, or when it is in time. Does this strange thing then exist, in which it would be at the moment when it changes? And Zeno says, what sort of thing is this? And Socrates says, the instant, or it could be translated quite literally, the suddenly. But in changing, it changes instantaneously. And when it changes, it can be in no time. And in that instant, it will be neither in motion nor at rest. Now, what Socrates has done at this point is broken you out of this sterile world of categories and brought you into a world in which things do happen, in which there are changes of state, in which there are singularities. And in fact, people in our organization have often referred to this question of the instant, the suddenly, the singularity as a singularity, a point in physical space-time where something happens. And it's not a phenomenon of rest, and it's not a phenomenon of motion. It's an actual physical action in the universe. And it's how and where you break into a new idea. Now, I want to compare this, and I know this is running relatively long, but I had a lot of dense ideas I wanted to get across. I want to compare this idea of the suddenly to go back to Plato's 7th letter, because these are clearly concepts that, again, like with the good, this is something which applies to the universe, and it's something which applies to the human mind. This suddenly it's in the macrocosm of the universe, and it's in the micro of the physical universe or physical space-time, and it's in the microcosm of your mind. And he does describe this in the 7th letter, where he has dismissed the idea that somebody had written down Plato's philosophy, because, as Plato says here, there does not exist, nor will there ever exist, any treatise of mine dealing with this, for it does not at all admit of verbal expression like other studies, but as a result of continued application to the subject itself and communion therewith, it is brought to birth in the soul on a sudden, as a light that is kindled by a leaping spark, and therefore it nourishes itself. This is where creative ideas come from. Creative ideas in the mind, which are a reflection of the way the universe itself is so constituted. This is where great music, great poetry, scientific breakthroughs, man's ability to make these capabilities accessible to others in the governance of our society. This is the process of generating higher hypotheses and of knowing how you generate higher hypotheses, which is the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. The enemy does not want you living in this domain. It wants you living in the world of the senses, the left side of that image, which I showed earlier. It wants you playing only with your beliefs and your opinions and picture thinking, as he described it. They don't want you in the domain of the mind. They don't want you to recognize that there is no conflict between the one and the many when you look at the universe in this way. They do not want you to, they don't want republics. That's certainly for sure. They either want democracies or they want dictatorships. And we know ultimately they simply use the democracies to get dictatorships. This is why they hate Plato, because Plato's dialogues are a constant series of provocations, as he says, provocatives, paradoxes, using metaphors to strengthen the ability of the mind to make these kinds of creative breakthroughs with a greater density, and to be able to communicate. And this is also the challenge. How do you communicate? How do you get out of Elon Musk's mind this breakthrough that he made? How do you communicate these ideas so that they can be put to work in your society? This is what the oligarchy is afraid of. And again, this is why they hate Plato, they hate the Republic, and they hate sovereign nations. So I think it might be an important lesson for us that if that's what they're afraid of and that's what they hate, this is what we have to figure out how to strengthen in the minds of our fellow citizens so that we can reclaim our republic. So I know I've gone through a lot tonight, but Plato is worth it to my thinking, and I'm ready to open it up for questions and comments.